It is going.
Would it be stupid to have music going? Like quiet loop music? Is that weird?
I think that would be fine. Anybody else think so? Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
I have no problem with it. Just we should have tested it, but that's okay. Go for it.
Give me a thumbs up, Brent, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, that sounds good here.
Well, good afternoon. How are you? Welcome to this Verse Like Water poetry reading. My name is Jeff Johnson. I serve on the English faculty here, and I direct Verse Like Water, which is concluding its 9th year as a reading series. And I am so excited to be hosting and introducing in a moment here Pádraig Ó Tuama, who's reading from Ireland. All poetry readings begin with thanks and praise, and I want to thank from my heart the Minnesota Legacy Fund, Five Wings Arts Council, Minnesota Public Radio, and a special thanks today to our videographers, Mark Ambrose and Brent Balmer, who are making this possible. Sorry about that. Padraig, I usually, when life is like usual, when I'm hosting a poet, I usually deliver a 3 to 4 minute, just crushingly beautiful introduction, which leaves the audience in tears before the poet even gets to the podium. And I'm still adjusting to the wonderful strangeness of hosting poets virtually, and that seems like an unnecessary act. So I'm going to swap out my profundity for a cheap attention-getting anecdote, which is more of an origin story. Padraig, 2 years ago, I hosted Spencer Reese, and we had a 2-day buddy story. And among the many things that he did for me friendship-wise was to start up a list of all the poets that he thinks I should be hosting. And your name was at the top of that list. So was your phone number too. He gave me that without asking permission. And serendipitously, pretty quickly after that, I was having coffee with my beloved wife, Jessie, one early Sunday morning, and your voice filled my glass porch because you were on Krista Tippett's On Being show. And I figured, well, this is the time to give him a call. And we spoke briefly on the telephone. You graciously agreed to become a Verse Like Water poet. And then the world changed. And this is not exactly what I had in mind, but from my heart, I thank you for reading for us today. And I had a student yesterday teach me that applause on Zoom should look like this. It should be a round of applause. So let's take it away. Thank you for reading for us.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. It is a lovely thing to be with you. I've heard about you and your reading series for so long from so many different people. Spencer speaks so warmly about you, as does Anya Batland. And I see Mark Conway inside here too. And I know that this is a gathering of friends, and I'm really pleased and moved to be here. Thank you so much. I'm not surprised that Spencer gave you my number. I'm surprised he didn't give you anything else too. Someday Spencer needs to learn how to blind carbon copy people too when he sends emails. I regularly get the email addresses of very famous people because Spencer has emailed us all at the same time. Anyway, it is a lovely thing to be with you. I thought I'd read some poems tonight of survival. I think survival is a word that sometimes is really worthwhile looking at. Coming from Latin originally, survive, to outlive. The vive, the vive at the end of that word is linked to revive and vivid and vivacity. All of these words speaking to us of life. And survive can sometimes sound perhaps like it is a bare minimum thing. But what survival teaches us is that there is a gritty and muscular hanging on to the experience of life that is so important at times of difficulty. And for so many, maybe not for you, certainly for somebody here, and certainly for many people in your life and my life and in our countries, the last year has been a year where survival alone would sound like a pretty good thing. So yeah, those are the poems that I'm going to do. As usual, I have an interest in form, so there's going to be a villanelle and a pantoum and some sonnets inside here. I know that sometimes formal poems make Americans explode, so hopefully that won't happen because, you know, nobody's there to clean up the mess. But we can talk about form too if you're interested. Here's a poem, which is an acrostic one, called L is for Lonely. I should say the Irish language is a pretty ever-present part of me thinking about language. And like for the word survival, we'd say Lannan Bun in Irish, which means to follow life, which I really like. Survive can mean perhaps to outlive in English, but in Irish, Lannan Bun means to follow life. And I love that idea that the question is, in a time of difficulty, where is life and how can I follow it? And the Irish word for lonely, this is the first poem, is going to be called L is for lonely. The Irish word for lonely is uigneach, and that word uigneach comes from the same word meaning grave. And so loneliness in a certain sense is a foretaste of death. L is for lonely. L is for lonely because that's what I've been. O is for ordinary, because these days it seems to me loneliness is ordinary, and ordinary is fine, and ordinary is going to be here for a while. N is for nothing, and the nothing's not lonely. The lonely is just ordinary, but the nothing is void. Lonely I can deal with. The ordinary's fine, but the nothing really scares me with its deep, vacant eyes. E is for everyone, because everyone's a little I. Everyone's a little lonely, a little happy, a little shy. Everyone's an anyone, and anyone could be me, the poor and the persecuted, the pure and the sleek. L is for licking the wound where I inscribed on my own ink, on my own skin, with my blood ink, the yearning I can't hide. And Y is for yonder, and yonder's not here, and right here is yonder to someone who's not here. And yonder rhymes with wander, and wander rhymes with love, and all love is a little lonely, made of ordinary stuff. I think for a long time I was looking to a literature, a religious literature, certainly for a long time, and other times any other literature that would do Irish language poetry, English language poetry from Ireland, Emily Dickinson, The Lord of the Rings. I was looking to any literature to give me validation for what it meant to be alive, and validation for feeling like I could be myself, because I had regularly felt separate from myself. And I never found it. I still haven't really. And one of the things that's helped has been to make it up. And that is, I think, one of the yearnings that's at the heart of literature, at the heart of many poems, is the fact that the person writing it needed to hear something and they couldn't find it anywhere else, or they couldn't find it in the right inflection or with the right melancholy or melody. And so they made it up. So here's a poem called What I Needed to Hear, which I wrote years after I needed to hear it. It's an early poem. I would critique this now, but I'm fond of it because it was necessary. What I needed to hear. This is my gift to you, this springtime blooming, this endless moving from life to deeper life. I will be your endlessness, your journey start and happy welcome home, your never ceasing, always shining moment. Caught up in the wink of eternity, you will be like you have always been before, never knowing. A decade of sunset evenings and the softest of all mornings to bathe your tender brow with healings of the deepest kind. I wondered for a long time who was speaking in that poem. The question as to who the speaker is in a poem is a strange one. And certainly that speaker isn't me. That is a poem of some quality of lullaby, I think. And I think I needed a quality of lullaby. Again, another form that is easily dismissed, but utterly vital when it comes to the question of what it means to form an unconscious and to live in an unconscious. An unconscious that has not had lullaby of one kind or another is an unconscious that will suffer. And so in the absence of them, I gave myself some. In a certain sense, that poem is a voice of kindness speaking. It's not God, because I think that is too complicated a notion to link the voice of kindness with. I don't know what it is. It's just a voice. more recently, I wrote another poem, which is almost a companion poem to that one, but it does play with science fiction. I do like these ideas of parallel universes where, you know, there's another Jeffrey Johnson doing great work in poetry in a parallel universe. Only this time he's covered in tattoos. I don't know. There's another version of us somewhere else, and I'm curious about these other lives. It's the fantasy and the curiosity of an unlived life and all of the things that would have happened had we taken a different turn. And so I began to think about another Padraig who looked at some of the times in my life when I was struggling the most and realized that this other Padraig had one word and one little window to shout through it. And I realized that I think that possibly happened, that somehow that other Padraig shouted the word poetry through a little window when I was about 5, because I have loved and recited and learned poetry off by heart since I was about 5. And it has been a constant balm in my life. It took me a long time to realize that that wasn't ordinary. So here's a poem in honor of that other Padraig. It's called The One Thing. There must have been some other me who lived some other time, who realized he knew the one thing that would save me. And he must have found a little window, opened it and shouted through it that saving sound that saved me. And he must have felt a failure, I am sure, that other me, because he failed. He didn't save me from the other things that beat me. And he must have sat like some sad God from sadder scriptures and wept at all he failed to do. He had so little time, and all my life I've been climbing up to little windows, opening them and saying the one thing I can say. Thank you. I'm sure anybody who has written poetry knows that the writing of a poem is in a deep connection to the not being able to write a poem, or to the gestation period that a poem might take, or not just a poem, just poetry in general. Michael Longley, who's a well-known poet from Belfast, talks about a decade of his life in his 40s. He's 82 now, but in his 40s, he thought poetry was gone, completely gone. And I think sometimes people call that writer's block, but I'm not sure that that's the right word to talk about it. It is a relationship with words, the not having of them. In the same way, I studied theology, and so I think the question of the presence of a God or the absence of a God is as profound a thing to pay attention to in not believing in it, as is the presence of poetry and the absence of poetry. The question as to whether words feel near to you or far from you, both of those are a relationship with words. And I think those periods of time in our life, a week, a month, a year, a decade, for those of us who are oriented around poetry, those periods of time where poetry isn't happening themselves are a certain form of poetry. They are a certain form of relationship. They are a certain form of recognizing that language is not doing its work in the same way that I think anybody who has a faith is called to pay attention to when God is not, to when God is gone, to when God doesn't exist for you. And the question about belief and unbelief, the question about presence and absence, are all inviting us to pay attention with mystery, I think, to the experience of the void of mystery and what that is like for us. Anyway, this is all by way of a little introduction to a poem called Postcards to a Dead Friend. I lived in Australia in my 20s, and I got a phone call on the wrong night, one night, from my mother telling me that my childhood best friend was dead, and I couldn't afford to get home for the funeral. And so I couldn't write for a year, I think. And about a year later, a friend came to me, and she said, she was a colleague and a friend. She said, I'd like to help. I know this last year has been hell, And she was very, very devout in her religion. And she said, I'd like to organize a group of people to pray for you every day for a week. And can you come into the room? And that sounded to me like hell. And so I said to her, that would not be much of a comfort. Gina is her name. And then I said to Gina, do you know what would be a comfort? Is if you asked those group of kind people if they wanted to do something practical. And somebody said, our family's got a house by the beach. Does he want it for a weekend? And I went to a house by the beach. And Gina, who did that, died on Saturday after a 10-year fight with cancer, 45 years old. I have very little certitude when it comes to religion. She was the opposite. She had so much certitude that it sometimes was overwhelming, but that certitude never got in the way of her compassion and her kindness and her phenomenal capacity for concrete acts of goodness. And so here's a poem in honor of the voice that she gave me and also in honor of her great life. Postcards to a Dead Friend. Since you died, I've wondered where you are, questioned hell and threatened heaven. Is there a place for those who say they don't believe? When you were 16, you said that you'd believe when you were older, maybe 40. You barely got halfway. Since you died, I think about my growing years differently. How dare you take my memories and paint them with the bitter vinegar of your sad sorrows? I had enough already. Since you died, I see your parents differently. Solitary walks do not mean peaceful rambles, and framed photographs are not artistic expression. They looked like they'd been winded for months. Since you died, I've thought about you more than I had in years. Called you a dickhead most often, and then lurched at what caused your final purging. Since you died, you will grow no older now. The 24-year-old Peter Pan of your mother's mind, her lost boy, caught in the Neverland between the grave and the sky. It is a strange thing that something so abstract as the presence of absence is a part of every ordinary life. And this, I think, is where poetry tries to do its work, not by filling it with certitude or even diagnosis or even analysis, but with a certain hymn or lament or song of joy or story or echo. This, I think, is one of the jobs of poetry. I grew up about 2 miles from a famine grave. There was a famine in Ireland from 1845 to 1848. Sometimes it's called the potato famine, but I would urge you never to call it the potato famine because it wasn't a potato famine. There was food enough to feed all the Irish throughout that whole time. It was a choice, like most famines are, my God. Ireland was providing 60% of the beef and 70% of the corn for Britain throughout that whole time. And in those years, it's estimated that perhaps 2 million people died and certainly 1 million left. The population of Ireland, while there was no formal census, the population of Ireland might have been 9 or 9.5 million in 1845. And then by 1880, the population of Ireland was 4 million, quite an extraordinary change in population, less than half, we think, although it's only a guess really as to what the population was previous to the famine. My great-great-grandfather was from West Cork. He was 6 years old or so, and his parents decided that they would take him and his brother to a Protestant soup kitchen. If you went to a Protestant soup kitchen, you could get soup provided you became a Protestant, which is why the question as to Catholicism and Protestantism in Ireland, even still today, is profoundly linked to the question of politics and British-Irish identity rather than anything to do with theology. Anyway, they were desperate. They only spoke Irish. They spoke no English. And they went to this Protestant soup kitchen, and they got separated from each other. And my great-great-grandfather never saw his brother or his parents again for the rest of his life. And he was taken in by a very kind and good and generous Protestant family who put him through school till he was 11. And they wished to put him through school till he was finished, 17 or 18, which would have given him an amazing prominence. But he was determined to find word of his family. So he left, walked the 60 miles to Cork City, got a job in a factory. That's where he worked the rest of his life. And any days off, he would go walking in search of news of his brother and his parents. Presumably they're in one of those famine graves, the likes of which I grew up nearby. So here is a villanelle, which is honoring that. It's called the potato famine, but the word potato is crossed out because it should be. It's a villanelle for any of you who enjoy form. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. My mother likes her peace and her diet magazines. My great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. At the heart of every famine is the scheming of a state to bring a people to their knees for the state's convenience. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. On the phone, an Englishwoman says the Irish are fixated with our stories of the past in a way that's quite obscene, but my great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. My auntie moved to England and learned how to translate between the way a people are and the way their history's been. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. There are proteins in our grass from forgotten famine graves. Some families fed on rotten grass, and my mother tells me my granddad's granddad was the only one who made it. His family had all starved, so he missed his confirmation. Decades later, a priest arranged it, didn't make a scene. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate, and my great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. This poem has a twin called Phytophthora infestans. That's the Latin name for the potato blight. It was well known that a potato blight was going to arrive in Ireland in 1845 because there's 2 crops of spuds every year, which is why it flourished so well in Ireland amongst poor people. And there was a potato blight making its way across Western Europe in the 1840s. So with each successive crop, it would creep a little more westward. There was devastating in Belgium, but there were alternatives to potatoes for poor people, so there wasn't a famine. When it came to Ireland, there was a request that went to the British government, who were the empire over Ireland, asking for the ports to be closed so that the Irish people could eat the corn and the beef that was being produced there. And the response came back saying no, and if there are fewer Irish people by the end of this, so much the better. When the potato blight enters the potato crop, the blight goes in under the leaf, and then it goes down and it rots the spud. I don't know if you've ever seen a blighted potato. It's disgusting. And then after that, the leaves turn white. And one of the things that this did is it changed the relationship in Ireland to the Irish language, because so many people who spoke Irish suddenly had to learn English in order to get all kinds of jobs. The politicization of language acquisition was forced on a people, which is another technology of empire. Of course, then there were enormous amounts of immigration, and Irish people have always told ourselves, and I certainly learnt this, that when Irish people left Ireland, we were the friend to the suffering everywhere. And that's not true at all, because Frederick Douglass said the following in 1853, and this is an epigraph to this next poem. Frederick Douglass had spoken warmly about his visit to Ireland in the 1840s, but in 1853, after Irish people had been washing up on the eastern seaboard of the United States for 8 years at this stage, he saw no evidence of any of the solidarity that he said Irish people had felt with enslaved peoples when he had visited Ireland. He saw the opposite, and this is what he said. The Irish who at home readily sympathize with the oppressed everywhere are instantly taught when they step upon our soil to hate and despise the Negro. They are taught to believe that he eats the bread that belongs to them. Sir, the Irish American will find out his mistake one day. So here's a pantoum, which is a 16-line poem coming from a form that's popular, that was made popular from Malaysia. There's a pantoum called Phytophthora infestans. We love to blame the British for our past, a past that's blighted by a story we won't own. God knows it wasn't that our suffering was mild at home, but when we travelled, we shacked up with empire and smited other places while crying about our home. Not with a rot of other people's making, but with a rot our own. And not because of how an empire shackled us, but because of something rotten in us. Certainly a rot of other people's making, not our own, starved us from our villages and homes, but because of something rotten in us, and not a blight that was exploited, we went and starved other peoples from their villages and homes. Our suffering was far from mild at home. Far from home, we uncovered something white within us. We love to blame the Brits for the stories we won't own. I'm going to read some sonnets in a while, but lest I overwhelm you with all kinds of pieces of form, I'll read something that isn't in form. I usually try to take a poet a year and read through all of their work, usually a dead poet. A few years back, I did that with Emily Dickinson and started with Johnson's arrangement and read through. It took me 2 years, not 1 year, 1,775 poems. And by the end, I knew much less about Emily Dickinson than I did at the beginning. I'd had all kinds of ideas about her previous to reading all of her work. And by the end, I had no ideas about her and was overwhelmed by her relationship and question with time and thrilled by her imagination and convinced more than I ever had been that being a recluse was not the question in her life. I think she knew she was too fucking good for anybody. And so she didn't bother trying to publish her work because I think she knew that she would have been colonized in a certain sense into what people thought she should have been writing. Later in her life, she wrote a poem which is about being forced into a marriage, which from what I know is not autobiographical from what we know. But there's a line in the poem when she's talking about being forced into this marriage, and she says, while she's casting it away, she says, "Amputate my freckled bosom." And I found myself thinking, who in the 1860s and 1870s was using language like that? Amputate my freckled bosom. And the word freckled there, my God, what a capacity to think through the power of language and the protest of language and to deliberately say stuff that she would have found to be unpublishable, or that others would have found to be unpublishable. So anyway, this isn't an Emily Dickinson poem, and this isn't even a poem to her, but it is in a certain sense a poem that is about the relationship to what it means to have a text. Like I said, I'd spent a lot of my life searching for a text that would be sufficient, a text of Irish history, a text of religion, a text of literature, a text of whatever. And every text has failed, which I think is the integrity of the text. A text that says that it's sufficient is a text to be wary of. So here's a poem about texts that deliberately abandon you. It's called "Let the Waters Swarm with a Swarm of Living Beings." I've been swimming around here for a while now, and while I've never touched the ocean floor, I've tried. You notice things out here, the way the wind makes waves chop at odd angles, the way the water feels warmer at the top, the way the moon makes music when you're half dead with cold, the ways of frozen bones, the way the morning never feels the same. Once a seal bumped me, came right up to me like a sea puppy, and I swear it smiled. I was floating happy after that. I said, the ocean was my home. Then the storm came, then the waves, then the lightning spiked the surface, thunder clapped, hungry beasts swam round me. I saw seagulls eyeing me for scraps. I'm going to read a few sonnets and finish off with sonnets, really. I went through some exorcisms to get rid of the gay devils in me when I was younger and involved in religion. And I told somebody I was gay, and somebody told somebody, and a Californian exorcist who was visiting Ireland manipulated the story out of me in public and put me through a humiliating ritual, which was the first of 3, really. And so over 20 years later, I found the curiosity to think, now that I've survived, and that kind of trauma, really, it isn't about surviving it to the next day, it's about surviving it to the next decade, and finding a way to live with it. And 2 decades later, I found myself curious in the form of art to think, what would I say about these experiences in poetry? So I wrote a sequence of sonnets called 7 Deadly Sonnets, and here's the first one. It's called Exorcism. I wish you weren't American. I wish you didn't see intrinsic evil in me. I wish you hadn't dragged my secret from me. Now I knew you knew already. Someone squealed. I wish you didn't put your hands on me while you were screaming at the devils in me, all my homosexualities. I wish you'd never gathered people round, instructing them to pray in tongues, or read from the book of Revelation, or chant, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wished you'd shut up, and I repeated, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wish he'd answered. I wished you dead, and I was frightened at the violence in me and the nest of demons in me. I wondered where they lived. In my semen, in the dreams I had of being kissed. Why did they breed in me? My God, my exorcist. I think I needed to have a form that could give me a tool for editing in order to be able to turn to these experiences. So having 7 sonnets, half a corona, I suppose, of sonnets, and having 7 of them helped me to have a possibility of scraping things off over and over. Like any poem, anybody who's writing poems, I wrote these and changed them and changed them and changed them. And I stuck to a strict form of sonnet length in terms of 14 lines and trying to put a volta in there somewhere. And that really helped me know where to pair things off. I thought about breaking out of the sonnet form for a while, but actually I'm not sure I would have known where to have stopped. And so the sonnet form was a functional form. I needed something that gave me the conceit of knowing where to stop. A little bit like making up a voice of consolation. It doesn't exist, but it helps anyway. There is a book of theology that has come out in the last week, and I have 15 sonnets in it. Because I studied and worked in theology for a while, I'm asked every now and then to write chapters for theological books that are coming out. And so I usually ask these days if I can write it in poetry, which is a lovely opportunity to think about religion through the lens of form. And so I decided that I'd write some new Stations of the Cross. If you don't know what Stations of the Cross are, they are 14 images that you find in Catholic and Episcopal churches between the time when Jesus of Nazareth was condemned to death by Pilate to the time when his dead corpse was laid in a tomb. And in some ways, they are a fascinating meditation on the idea of chaptering. Somebody has taken this sequence from the texts of the Christian Gospels and chaptered them in a certain sense visually. And there's repetition. Jesus falls 3 times in the Stations of the Cross, and there's something fascinating about them. I think they're extraordinary. So I made some new ones up, and the titles for all of these they have the name Jesus in them, but really I'm not talking about Jesus. I'm using the name Jesus as a blank slate for the every person. A friend of mine was working for a church, and when they found out he was gay, they put him under the censure of a committee, and the censure put 3 requirements on him, one of which was don't talk about being gay, one of which was don't act gay, whatever that meant, and then the third one was don't dress gay. And so he used to lay out his clothing every day and text me a photograph asking me whether he thought his clothing was homosexual or not, which was in itself a very gay thing to do, as I reminded him on a regular basis. So here's a poem called Jesus Dresses. Not that one, you decide, replacing the top that suits you beautifully with the one they won't deride, or at least won't use to justify your firing. You lay out an outfit on the bed, like the clothing for a corpse, and text your friend a shot to check it's not too gay. Texting me your costume of the day is very gay, your friend replies. You set everything you wear on fire. Here's a poem called Jesus Considers Pronouns. Certainly in the English language, there's a lot of people for whom he and she don't work, and they and their are the pronouns they prefer. And so here is a poem considering that. Jesus considers pronouns. I should say this poem finishes off with the word slew, S-L-E-W, and that is one of the words, and not slew is in the past participle of slay, but slew is in the word meaning crowd, like a slew of people. And that word slew is one of the words that's come from Irish into English. The Irish word for crowd or gathering or group is slua. And so slua has become anglicized as slew, and it's coming. There's only a few words that have come from Irish into English, whiskey being one of them. Jesus considers pronouns. The way he has never worked for you, she neither. The way they sounds plural, and that's just how you like it. The way them makes you feel like you belong. The way there can be possessed and you've never felt like anything you owned would fit. The way you like conjugating yourselves in the first and the second and the many. The way we are legion makes sense in a way that nothing else makes sense. The way you breathe now that your plurals are made personal. The way you are the singular and the slew. I worked in conflict resolution for a long time, particularly in Belfast, and the 2 areas of conflict that I looked at were particularly the question of British-Irish conflict over the last 700 years and the question about how that manifests itself in politics these days, and then also working in LGBT safety, working particularly with people who would justify violence toward LGBT people by religious means. And one of the things that you learn in conflict is that the very, very simple question about what are the facts might take you as long as the conflict will to figure out, because the perception of a fact, the careful selecting of a fact, all of these things are a choice. They are a certain form of hermeneutic. They are a certain form of unobserved curation of a sequence of convenient imaginations in order to justify what it is that you're doing towards another group of people. And in conflict resolution, what you're hoping to do, without making a person feel like they're falling apart, but really you're hoping that a person might, with curiosity, begin to go, wow, what are the other ways these facts could have been understood? And that isn't a threat. In fact, it's an invitation. And so I have a poem called The Facts of Life, which I'll finish with, and then we'll have some time for questions. which is my favorite part all the time. And thank you for your silence, which is mostly curated by the fact that you're all on mute. But I'm really looking forward to hearing your voices. The facts of life. That you were born and you will die. That you will sometimes love enough and sometimes not. That you will lie, if only to yourself. That you will get tired. That you will learn most from the situations you did not choose. That there will be some things that move you more than you can say. That you must be loved. That you will avoid questions most urgently in need of your attention. That you began as the fusion of a sperm and an egg of two people who once were strangers and may well still be. That life is real, and if you can survive it, well, survive it well, with love and art and meaning given where meaning is scarce. That you will learn to live with regret. That you will learn to live with respect. That the structures that contain you may not be permanently containing. That you will probably be okay. That you must accept change before you die, but you will die anyway. So you might as well live, and you might as well love. You might as well love. You might as well love. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for, yes, for journeying to Minnesota to give us this just a superb poetry reading. We have 4 questioners coming your way, 2 precious students of mine, excuse me, and the American poet Mark Conway, who needs no introduction. But we'll start with a beloved colleague of mine because he's got to go get his second flu shot. Ryan Deblock, a professor in the English department here, who wears fleece only year-round, even on warm summer days, Padraig.
It is true for half the year, but no. Warm summer days, no. Nice to meet you, Padraig. Thank you
Nice to
for
meet you,
reading for
Ryan.
us.
My pleasure.
My question that I like to ask of all the poets that Jeff has brought, and I believe I asked it of Mr. Mark Conway as well, is has there been a, and you mentioned The Lord of the Rings, and you mentioned, interest in science fiction. And has there been a science fiction or fantasy text or a graphic novel, when you're talking about the Stations of the Cross, I thought about the intersection of pictures and words that has been influential to you?
I would say that The Lord of the Rings has certainly been a book, not the films, but the books have influenced me hugely. I think I read The Lord of the Rings first when I was 15, and by the time I was 25, I'd read it 15 times. There was a way within which those characters and almost the plot changed depending as to what stage I was in my life. Obviously, I mean, any good story can mean all kinds of things at once. And certainly Lord of the Rings meant all kinds of things at once. I remember I was making a decision at one point and trying to figure out, was it the right decision or the wrong decision, which isn't necessarily, I mean, the right according to who. And I was reading that part where Frodo is at the Council of Elrond and trying to decide who will take the ring, and all these warriors are suggesting they'll take the ring, and Boromir is saying he'll take the ring, and they're assuming it will be, a warrior of some kind of repute. And something seizes Frodo and he stands up and says, I will take the ring, but I do not know the way. And everybody looks at him. And then Elrond says, if you say this freely, then I say that it's right. And it's the clause at the start there. If you say this freely. That changed me when it came to the question of the discerning of a decision. So that's just one example about a text that I've traveled with.
Thank you.
I could also argue, although it's not quite within your context, but I would, if we were thinking only of television, I would say 6 Feet Under.
And I'm not familiar with that one.
Oh, it's, I think, the best thing that was ever made for television.
Oh.
Story of a what were they called? An undertaker family in Los Angeles. And I think it was one of the finest pieces of television. There is before 6 Feet Under and there's after when it comes to the question of character on television.
Thank you.
Well as thinking how much can you mess with the audience and how in depth can you go, trusting that the audience will come with you. There is nothing like it.
I'm going to put on my list. Thank you.
Pleasure. Nice to meet you, Ryan. All the best with your shot.
Thanks.
Taryn.
Hi.
Hi, Taryn.
So you recently had In the Shelter premiere in North America. Congratulations.
Thanks very much.
As I was reading it, there's a bit where you write about how your mother thinks she saw Mother Mary at the foot of her bed.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if this had affected how you write your poems or how you approach your more religious themed poems now.
I'm just trying to make sure that I've understood the question. So is it that the story that my mother had in her mind about being visited by Mary, does the way that that happened in the way that she told it to me, does that influence the way that I think about religion and poems? Did I get that right, Taryn?
Kind of just like how you like reacted to it and thought about it after she told you. Like, do you think that had any lasting themes in your writing?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, the story is that my mother had been going through a terrible 20 years, really, and she woke up one day. She was terribly depressed for a very long time, and she would spend most of every afternoon in bed. And she woke up one day because a strange woman had walked into her room, and my mother knew immediately it was Mary, the Mother of God. And the woman sat down on the bed, and my mother said she felt the depression of the mattress where this woman sat down. And Mary looked at my mother and said to her, "You've never liked me very much, have you?" And my mother looked at her and said, "No, I haven't." And Mary said, "That's okay." And then my little brother walked into the room, and my mother turned her head and turned back, and Mary was gone. The star of the sea. I mean, my mother's mother had only died, in the last year. So, I mean, you could argue all kinds of explanations of that. But I suppose for me, when I heard that story, when she told it to me, I was really uninterested as to how to explain it, and much more interested in as to what quality of survival does that do. I have an ambivalent relationship with the question of religion. I love its literature. I love the wildness and the violence of the Bible. Half the time I think that people who claim to know the Bible don't read it. My God, it's a vicious text the whole way throughout it. But I am not in any way interested in anybody joining a religious group. I'm, like lots of us, horrified at the abuses of power in religion. And so I suppose what I always want to do with the question of these characters that exist in a religious imagination, Mary, for instance, or Jesus of Nazareth, or any of these characters, is to find a way where they can be decolonized from the question of doctrine and dogma. Because I think any of these characters, if they did exist historically, are much more interesting than the persona and presentation that they would be given through doctrine and dogma, because that shuts down the imagination rather than opens it up. And what's powerful about my mother's experience of Mary, the Mother of God, is that I don't think I've ever met anybody who would have predicted what Mary said to my mother. "You never liked me very much, did you?" And also, and this is what's so important, is that even my mother herself couldn't have predicted how she would have answered, with the plainness that she does not have in her life normally. No. And that no itself, I think, might have been the real miracle, that my mother heard herself tell the truth to religion in the form of a grey-haired Mary, the Mother of God, looking like she was about 70, is what my mother said, wearing ordinary clothes, curly cropped hair, wandering into her room. And the no back to her in itself was its own healing. And that, I think, is what religion might be. And I think I'd like to live for that. I think I might have only experienced it once or twice in my life.
Sweet Naomi Ringhand, take the wheel.
Thank you, Jeff. Padraig, thank you for reading. That was absolutely beautiful.
Thanks, Naomi.
Yes, as you were reading today, I was so struck by how you welcome and just like name the raw and sometimes rugged experiences of human life. But in doing that, like, and in welcoming them as they are, you also let them retain a level of mystery that's proper to them, which is extraordinary and almost sacramental. So I'm wondering what experiences, people, or poems have taught you that disposition of receptivity and also reverence toward human experience, and what significance does that have, or has that had in your life and your work?
Thanks, Naomi. I think I heard Marie Howe has spoken at this gathering. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Jeffrey or Mark? Yeah. One of the things, if I was to sum up what I think Marie is doing in her poems, she is trying to see, and she is trying to see what is there in being a person, in seeing, in naming something of the experience of being human. And she's uninterested in exaggeration, as well as perhaps clevernesses of language or artistry that would get in the way. And I think Marie Howe is regularly interested in seeing what is, not because it's good or bad, but because it is what it is. And in that context, something very powerful must be observed. There's a distillation process in that. There's nothing fast. And I think Marie Howe's words have changed the way I think about what it means to use language and what it means to observe and what it means to look. Because there's the first impulse when you get an idea for a poem to go, oh, great, I've got this good idea. It might even be clever. It might be good. It might be moving. But then there's the question for me about what will come next, and what will come next, and what will come next. There's a Japanese group facilitation methodology where you ask the question why 5 times when somebody tells you something, not as a cornering, not as an accusation, but as an unfolding. And that, I think, is one of the things that Marie's poems have so many layers to them, while at the same time speaking in a form that's recognizable to human experience. So, yeah, I think her work has done that for me. And then another poet whose work I think has brought me to a certain way of thinking, this time more about language than anything else, is the Irish language poet Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill. She only writes in Irish, and her work is really quite extraordinary. Lots of it is a lament for a language that was taken away, but also a reviving of a language by writing the kinds of Irish language poetry that other people weren't. She was part of an Irish language revival. She's still alive, still writing. She's quite brilliant. So the Wake Forest Book of Irish Women Poets is a great anthology of contemporary poets writing in English and in Irish. So published by Wake Forest. So those are 2 people that I'd suggest are people who've helped me to see Naomi.
Thank you. It's lovely.
Padraig, the brilliant Mark Conway, is many things to many people. To me, with him living 2 miles away from me through the forest, he's mainly a rival gardener. He thinks he's better at it than me. It's the only thing I've ever seen him be mistaken about.
I think objectively it's been proven that I'm far better than you, Jeff. Padraig,
You
hello.
know, I'm a conflict mediator. Yeah, we can
That's
sort
right.
this out
That's
later
right.
on.
We need you. We need your poems. That was such a beautiful reading. Thank you. And you give so much of yourself to the poems and to these presentations. It's very moving. So thank you. I want to hear more about Irish. And, you know, it seems that that language is in your head as much as English, perhaps, or almost. And what it's like, how does that work for you as you think about bringing your life into words? I don't know if there are political dimensions, or if it's more the textures of the language, that Irish might do some things that English doesn't. And I just don't have that, of having two languages bouncing about in my head. I just like to hear you think about that aloud a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's lovely to be in the same room as you. I think having more than one language is always going to invite you into thinking about where is it that you start, because when it comes to the question of any language, you don't start in any language the way you'd start in other languages typically. I learned Irish when I was younger because my mother was so sick. I was looked after for 3 or 4 hours a day for 2 years by a woman from West Kerry, Ballyferriter, on the Dingle Peninsula, if any of you know that part of Ireland. And she was living in Cork city with her niece. I thought she was about 200. She was probably 60 or 65. I mean, I was 2 going on 3 and 4 and 5. And my dad said to me years later that once he heard her try to say something in English, and she had vocabulary, of course she had in English, but she had no grammar. She had no idea about how to speak English, really. And that repository of experience, of fluency and syntax, and also that there was a period of my life, and it was, I mean, I don't engage in comparisons of life. My life was difficult. There was a period of my life when I had a different language to describe it that started in different places. That fact itself is enough for an unconscious to find some space to breathe, to realize that I was able to say things that other people wouldn't have understood. I got to primary school fluent in both languages, but didn't know I was fluent in both languages. Instantly, the teacher said to us in our first few days of primary school that she was going to teach us a new language. And she said a few words and said, "You won't understand them, but that's okay." And I thought I was in trouble because I did understand them. And suddenly I was in conflict. The teacher told me something that I knew not to be true, and I blamed myself for it. And a life unfolded. So I turned to religion because I needed more blame in my life, I suppose. But what that does, I think, is that there's always a conversation within yourself when you have two languages. How do you say that here? What metaphor do you turn to? Could you say that in this language? I love the word co-love in Irish. It suggests two hands working together, not from the same people. Two hands working in some kind of partnership. And it's how you say the word solidarity in Irish. So when you say people are in solidarity with each other, you say that they are in mutual handing with each other. And I love that. And it's there's something about the etymology of Irish which I find to be so concrete that I find really very, very helpful. I don't think Irish is unique. I think the question is what are the languages all around you? For Poetry Unbound, the podcast that I present with On Being, for season 3, we have a poem from Margaret Newden, who's an Ojibwe language poet, and she recites the poem for us and then recites it in Ojibwe language as well as in English. And then I do a reflection on it. And she speaks beautifully about the power of knowing the language that's indigenous to the place where you live. And she invites people to learn a few words of the language. She's not interested in shaming people for not being fluent. She's interested in saying, look, if you learn 70 words of the language that is much, much older than the thing you call the United States, based as to where you live, how interesting is that? And your relationship with the place will change because you'll know people have called this creek this name for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that will change your relationship with place. And certainly that's how I find it with Irish. And that is absolutely political. And certainly in a situation where Irish was removed and in the north, it's still not given proper protected status. but it isn't only political, it is also artistic, and it goes into the question, in a certain sense, of the ensoulment of what it means to be a people. We have a phrase in Irish, Tír gan teanga, tír gan anam, a land without a language is a land without a soul. And there's something about having the ensoulment that is in itself a public and political, but also a private and artistic experience, about the repository of words for a thing that's around you, and it brings you into a conversation that is much, much older than your own imagination. I'll finish with, I was reading a book by Richard Holloway, the retired Episcopal Bishop of the Church of Scotland in Edinburgh, and he was quoting a scientist, and somebody had once said that they wanted to make, how do you go about making a loaf of bread from scratch? And the scientist said, well, first you invent the universe, and then, and I loved that, because it implies that none of us is doing anything alone. No poet is doing anything utterly unique, because we're all in a conversation with the very thing of language and the very thing of imagination.
Hands together.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Padraig, thank you so very much for providing an absolutely wonderful hour for all of us here in Minnesota. It was just awesome, and I hope to someday meet you in person so we can hug.
I look forward to it.
Continue our friendship. I know I'm speaking to people that I can't see on our YouTube audience. Thanks for attending and coming. And we have one more poetry reading this year. Verse Like Water will conclude its 9th year of programming on April 27th. Belarusian poet Valsina Mort will read from her office at Cornell. And then we'll start up for year 10 next year, as hard as it is to plan for things. God bless you, Padraig, and everyone. Farewell.
Thanks very much, Jeffrey. Thanks so much to everybody. It's a real honor to be with you.